You know, if you've ever found yourself sort of puzzling over Christian views of the future, hearing terms like premillennialism and postmillennialism maybe, it can feel a bit like trying to learn a new language. You're definitely not alone in that. So that's exactly what we're going to dig into today. These two really significant ways of thinking about, well, Christian eschatology, the end times. We'll look at their core ideas, you know, the biblical passages people point to, and also some of the, let's say, the tricky questions that come up. And while, yeah, it's tempting to want the one right answer, the truth is these theological debates are often pretty nuanced. Our aim here is really clarity, just understanding these different perspectives better.
Absolutely. And just to get us started, it helps to remember the central idea we're revolving around, the millennium, this concept of a significant period, often pegged at 1,000 years, linked to Christ's return. It's been interpreted in, frankly, lots of different ways throughout history. But today, like you said, we're focusing specifically on premillennialism and postmillennialism.
Okay, great. Let's jump right into premillennialism then. So the core belief here, what is it exactly?
Right. The main idea for premillennialism is that Christ returns before, that's a literal 1,000-year reign on earth. So the thinking is things might get pretty difficult globally, then Christ returns visibly, sets up his kingdom, and rules directly for 1,000 years of peace.
Okay, so return then the 1,000 years. And this view, it often carries a certain expectation about the world beforehand, right? Maybe things getting worse.
That's often part of it, yes. A view that society might decline leading up to Christ's return. And that, can influence how believers think about engaging with, say, politics or social issues.
Makes sense. And where do they see this in the Bible? What's the scriptural basis?
Well, the absolute key passage is Revelation chapter 20, verses 1-6. It explicitly mentions 1,000 years and Christ reigning. Premillennialists generally take this very literally.
A literal 1,000 years.
Yes. And they might argue that even within symbolic apocalyptic literature like Revelation, there can still be straightforward prophetic statements alongside the dragons and beasts.
Right. It's not all symbolism to them. And it's not just Revelation, is it? I seem to remember Old Testament links too.
Definitely. They often point to Old Testament prophecies, like in Isaiah 2 or Zechariah 14, passages that talk about a future glorious earthly kingdom centered on Israel. These are seen as fulfilled after Christ comes back.
Yeah, I remember reading Zechariah 14, the descriptions of his feet on the Mount of Olives. It's very physical, very earthly.
It is, and that vividness lends itself to a literal reading.
Okay, what about the New Testament, beyond Revelation?
Jesus' own words in the Olivet Discourse, Matthew 24, Luke 21, are crucial. His descriptions of a visible, powerful return are seen as the event that kicks off this earthly golden age, this millennium.
Got it. And you also find within premillennialism this idea, particularly in what's called dispensationalism.
Yes, exactly.
About a distinction between God's plan for Israel and for the church.
That's a really important strand. Dispensational premillennialism strongly emphasizes these distinct phases or dispensations in God's plan. They see that future earthly kingdom as the specific fulfillment of promises made to national Israel in the Old Testament.
And this view, premillennialism, especially the dispensational kind, it feels very prominent today, doesn't it?
Oh, absolutely. Its influence in modern evangelicalism is huge. You mentioned dispensationalism. That framework really propelled premillennialism's popularity in the last century or so.
Yeah, you see it in pop culture, things like the Left Behind books, for example.
Exactly. And it's taught by many well-known pastors and theologians, like John MacArthur, for instance. It has a strong contemporary presence.
Okay. But like any view, it faces questions or challenges, right? What are some of those?
Sure. One major discussion point is, again, the interpretation of Revelation. Critics argue it's fundamentally symbolic literature. Rich imagery, metaphors, dragons, multi-headed beasts.
Right. Not exactly literal history in advance.
Precisely. So the question becomes, how do you decide which bits are literal predictions and which are symbolic pictures of spiritual realities? It's a hermeneutical challenge, how you interpret the text.
That makes sense. It's about the genre.
It is. Another point, often raised specifically about the dispensational version, is the idea of the pre-tribulation rapture.
Yes. The idea that believers are taken away before a period of great suffering.
Correct. Critics often argue that finding clear, explicit New Testament support for that specific timing, the pre-trib timing, is difficult. There's debate among premillennialists themselves on the timing, actually.
Okay, and historically, was it always this popular?
That's another point often raised. Historically, it wasn't the majority view in the early centuries of the church, nor during the Protestant Reformation. Other views were more common then.
Interesting. Okay, that gives us a good handle on premillennialism. Let's shift gears now. Postmillennialism, how does that differ? It sounds like the opposite sequence.
It is, in terms of sequence. Postmillennialism teaches that Christ returns after, that's the post, a period of great Christian influence and progress in the world. This period is often called the millennium, but it's not necessarily seen as a literal 1,000 years. It's more of a long era of peace, justice, and righteousness brought about by the power and spread of the gospel.
So a much more optimistic view of history leading up to the return.
Generally, yes. Historically, it fostered a real optimism about the church's ability to positively transform culture and society.
And that optimism had real-world effects, didn't it? Like on missions or social reform?
Absolutely. It was a powerful motivator for things like the great missionary movements of the 19th century and efforts towards social justice. The belief was that Christians could and should work to usher in this golden age through faithfulness to the Great Commission.
Okay, so where do postmillennialists find their scriptural support for this gradual world-changing progress?
They often point to passages like Matthew 24.1, Jesus saying the gospel must be preached to all nations before the end comes. They see this global evangelization not just as a sign, but as the means by which the world is gradually won for Christ.
Okay, the preaching itself brings the change.
In a sense, yes, through the power of the Spirit working through the gospel message. They also look at Old Testament prophecies, like Psalm 72, which speaks of kings bowing down and the whole earth being filled with God's glory. They often interpret these not necessarily as applying only after a future return, but as something the church participates in fulfilling now during this age.
And the Great Commission, Matthew 28, seems central here too. Make disciples of all nations.
Exactly. That mandate is huge for postmillennialism. It implies a comprehensive cultural impact, not just individual conversions. The strength of the view for many is how it integrates these Old Testament hopes into the ongoing mission of the church.
And you often find this linked with covenant theology, right? As opposed to dispensationalism.
Yes, very often. Covenant theology tends to see more continuity in God's plan, viewing the church as the inheritor of the promises made to Israel. So, the church becomes the primary vehicle through which God establishes his kingdom influence on earth, fulfilling those Old Testament prophecies.
And historically, this view had some heady hitters behind it.
Oh, certainly. It was very influential in Reformed circles for a long time. Thinkers like Jonathan Edwards, Charles Spurgeon, in some periods, many giants of the faith held to a form of postmillennialism. It really fueled that 19th century sense of progress and Christian expansion.
It's fascinating how dominant it once was. But then things changed. The 20th century must have been tough for that kind of optimism.
That's putting it mildly. Yes, the sheer devastation of the world wars, the rise of totalitarianism, the Holocaust, these kinds of global catastrophes really challenged the idea of inevitable, steady progress towards a Christianized world.
Yeah, it's hard to maintain that optimism when you see that level of human-caused destruction.
It became much harder. That's a significant challenge postmillennialism has had to wrestle with in the modern era. How do you reconcile the view with the realities of sin and suffering on such a massive scale?
Fair point. Any other critiques?
Well, it also gets critiqued, often by amillennialists, for potentially conflating the current church age with the millennium of Revelation 20. Amillennialists would argue that Revelation 20 is symbolic of Christ's current reign, not a future or progressively realized golden age on earth before the return.
So a different reading of Revelation 20 again.
Exactly. And some also feel there's a tension between the postmillennial long view of gradual progress and the New Testament's emphasis on the nearness or imminence of Christ's return passages, like James 5.8, the coming of the Lord is near.
Right. How do you hold both a long process and an imminent return? Okay, so we've an unpacked premillennialism return before a literal 1,000 years, often expecting decline. And postmillennialism return after a period of gospel success, often expecting progress. It really feels like the core difference boils down to how you read the Bible, especially prophecy.
That's absolutely central. The theological and hermeneutical, the interpretive approach is key. Premillennialism generally favors a more literal, futurist reading, especially of prophecy. And often, as we said, distinguishes sharply between Israel and the church.
Literal interpretation, future focus.
Right. Whereas postmillennialism tends towards a more symbolic or perhaps non-literal reading of some prophecies, often within a covenantal framework that sees continuity between Israel and the church.
Symbolic interpretation, present-future focus through the church.
Broadly speaking, yes. And that difference plays out very clearly in how they understand that specific phrase, 1,000 years, in Revelation 20.
Yeah, that seems to be ground zero for the debate. Literal future earthly reign versus a symbolic representation of the church's era of influence.
Precisely. The interpretation of that one passage drives a lot of the difference.
Now, we've touched on amillennialism a few times as a comparison. Can we just briefly clarify its position relative to these two?
Sure. Amillennialism, the A, meaning no literal millennium, takes a different tack altogether. It views the 1,000 years in Revelation 20 symbolically, representing the entire period between Christ's first and second comings.
Sure.
So the millennium is happening now.
So Christ is reigning now.
Yes, reigning now in heaven and through his church on earth by the Spirit. Amillennialism doesn't expect a future literal 1,000-year kingdom on earth before the final return, nor does it generally expect a world-dominating golden age brought about solely by the church's efforts before he comes back.
No future earthly millennium, no pre-return golden age through human effort.
Correct. It sees the current age as a mixture of the kingdom's presence and ongoing spiritual battle, culminating in Christ's final decisive return, resurrection, and judgment.
And this view also has historical weight.
Very much so. Figures like Augustine, later John Calvin, and many in the Catholic Orthodox and mainline Protestant traditions have held this view. It sees Christ's resurrection and ascension as the key inaugural events of his reign.
Okay, that helps situate the three main views. So going back to our main focus, pre- and postmillennialism, when people ask, okay, where one is right, it sounds like the answer is complicated.
It is complicated. There's no single verse that says premillennialism is correct or postmillennialism is the answer. Both views are held by thoughtful, sincere, Bible-believing Christians who find valid scriptural arguments for their position.
It really depends on your starting point, doesn't it?
It does. Your hermeneutics, how you approach interpreting scripture, especially prophecy, literal versus symbolic, your theological framework, covenant versus dispensational theology, how you see Israel and the church relating.
And maybe even your general outlook on history and society, whether you tend to see things as generally improving or declining.
That can play a role too, consciously or unconsciously. Historical context certainly influences how these views are perceived and embraced.
So, summarizing the landscape today, premillennialism is pretty strong in evangelical circles.
Yes, especially charismatic and dispensational evangelicalism. Postmillennialism, while less dominant than it once was due to those 20th century challenges, still has proponents, particularly in some Reformed areas.
And amillennialism remains widespread in Catholic, Orthodox, and many Protestant denominations.
That's a fair snapshot.
Yeah.
But it's crucial to remember as we wrap up
that
these are generally considered secondary issues within Christian doctrine.
Meaning they aren't core salvation issues.
Exactly. Whether you lean pre, post, or amillennial, all these views affirm the really central, non-negotiable truths. Christ will return physically. There will be a resurrection of the dead. There will be a final judgment.
Those are the main things.
Those are the foundational anchors. The debates are about the timing and nature of events surrounding that return. So the call for believers isn't necessarily to have the perfect eschatological chart figured out, but to live faithfully under Christ's present lordship, focused on loving God and neighbor and fulfilling the Great Commission. Augustine had some wise words here, something like, we must not be too certain about these matters, for they are veiled in mystery.
That's a great quote. A good dose of humility is probably needed when talking about the future. Okay, this has been really helpful in clarifying the landscape of premillennialism and postmillennialism. We've looked at the core ideas, the scriptures, the strengths, the challenges. We hope this deep dive has brought some clarity for you listening, helping you understand these different ways Christians approach thinking about the future. So as you reflect on all this, maybe read some of those passages yourself. Here's a final thought to consider. Given these different understandings of the future that faithful Christians have held, what aspects of God's character, maybe his sovereignty, his faithfulness, his plan for redemption, what resonates most deeply with you? And how does that shape your own perspective on what we call the end times, something to chew on?